talking here before about the fact that every year fewer and fewer Americans identify themselves as Christians, and that's something that gets a lot of attention in the press, people occasionally. But there's something else going on that doesn't get as much attention that is related to that, and that is the decline of the major denominations in the United States. The major denominations are all declining at a rapid rate. The largest Presbyterian denomination has lost 60% of its members since the year 2000. Lutherans and Episcopalians have suffered even greater declines than that. The United Methodist denomination loses about 150,000 a year. And that's really why I wanted to talk about this today, is because the United Methodist Church is in the process of a split. Most of the Methodist churches in Cleveland County are leaving the United Methodist denomination. There's only less than a handful that will remain. The two big ones in Shelby are going to remain, but they have declined so much over the past few years that they're not much of a factor anymore. And I'm sure they'll soon be faced with how they're going to maintain these buildings. But the great majority of Methodist churches in Cleveland County are leaving. And that is something that was voted on yesterday with a special session of one of their conferences. All the ones up around us are leaving. There's only about 4 that stay in Cleveland County. Now, one of the only segments of Christianity that is on the rise right now is that with which we are associated with, small churches that are independent and not associated with any denomination. So I think really this is what the future of Christianity will look like in the United States. The Methodist churches they have a term for the churches that are leaving. They call it disaffiliating. And so like up where we live, Knob Creek, Cadish, St. Peter, Hebron, those up there, New Home, they're all disaffiliated. And I was thinking about that this week, and I thought, every one of us disaffiliated from some denomination. That's true. We have people that come here who've disaffiliated from Methodist churches. We have people who've disaffiliated from Baptist churches. We have people who've disaffiliated from Catholic churches, Presbyterian churches, Episcopal churches. So we're all disaffiliators. And with that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the 2 major denominations in this area, as Baptist and Methodist. And both of those churches, though, came out of denominations that don't represent much of a factor around here anymore. Presbyterian and Episcopalian. So I think that if we want to talk about the Baptist and the Methodists, they all come out of a man named John Calvin. Now, John Calvin lived in the 1500s, and he developed a belief that God is interested in one thing. God only cares about one thing. God cares about making himself look good. That's all God cares about. He cares about nothing but bringing glory to himself, as Calvin put it. And Calvin believed that God brings glory to himself by showing justice and mercy. And of course, if God was sitting up there in heaven ages and eons ago, he didn't have anyone to show justice and mercy toward, so he created the world. And he put human beings in it. Some of those human beings he made to sin. And these people deserve God's wrath. He sends them to hell and thereby shows his mercy, his justice. You sin, you go to hell, God shows his justice. Some of those people, though, God made sin, and he shows mercy to them and lets them go to heaven. And so God brings glory upon himself by causing all people to sin and then he gives some what they deserve, sends them to hell, thereby showing his justice. He pardons some and lets them go to heaven, thereby showing his mercy. And so that was the main idea of John Calvin. And notice that God makes everyone sin. God decides who he's going to send to heaven and who he's going to send to hell. That was decided before you were ever born. You have no say into it. You are nothing more than a tool by which God brings glory upon himself. And hopefully, you'll be a tool by which God brings glory upon himself by showing mercy, because if you're a tool by which God brings glory upon himself by showing justice, you'll burn in hell for eternity. Now, although we might today look at Calvin's ideas and find them horrible, at the time they were attractive to very many people, and they are the biggest influence on American Christianity. By far, John Calvin's ideas were the biggest influence on American Christianity. It became very popular in what's called the West, the United States and Europe. Now, I want to back up a little bit. The early settlers of this country were mainly from England. And in England, there was just one denomination. That was the Church of England. And the Church of England came into being in the year 1531. The king back then, Henry VIII, had a succession of wives, and he wanted to divorce one wife and marry another one, and the Pope said, "No more divorces for you." And so the Pope refused to allow him to get a divorce. So what Henry VIII did was just pull all of the English churches out of the Roman Catholic Church and said, "I'm going to make my own and put them under me. I'll rule the church." And so Henry pulled those churches out. That became known as the Church of England, what we commonly refer to as the Anglican Church, and that is what the Episcopal denomination came out of. The Church of England was a state church. It was a government-run church with the King of England as its head. And even today, that man that they coronated yesterday as King of England is still the head of the Church of England. If that's not enough to give you butterflies, I don't know what would be. But anyway, in the 1600s, Calvinism became the dominant theology of the Church of England. And remember, the 1600s was the time when a lot of people were leaving England and coming to the United States. And so those early settlers to the United States were Calvinists. The Puritans were Calvinists. You know, back then, the reason the Puritans came here is they were dissatisfied with the Church of England. And there was a lot of disillusionment back then with the Church of England. A lot of groups were forming that were dissatisfied with the Church of England for one reason or another. And all these taken together were known as English separatists. They didn't agree with each other on what they were dissatisfied with, but they were dissatisfied with the Church of England, all these little groups, and they wanted to separate themselves from it. One of those groups was led by a man named John Smith. He lived around the turn into the 1600s. And John Smith did not like the idea of a government-run church. He believed that the church should be separate from the government and independent. He also did not like all the rituals and pomp and circumstance within the Church of England. He felt religious services should be more simple. He felt they should be more from the heart. And his ideas were not popular within the Church of England. And he eventually left England because of religious persecution and went to Amsterdam. And at some point, Smith started reading the New Testament, and he realized there that baptism as talked about in the New Testament is completely different from baptism as it was practiced in the churches. The only examples of baptism in the New Testament are baptisms of adults after they have made the decision to become a Christian and believe in Jesus. But you see, in the Church of England and in the Roman Catholic Church, infants were baptized within days of being born. And so Smith decided that if you wanted to follow the example from the New Testament, you baptize someone when they decided on their own to become a follower of Jesus. That is what is called believer baptism. It's when someone is baptized after they make the decision to become a Christian. That is where the Baptist Church came from the ideas of John Smith. All of the Baptist denominations that are in the United States today descend from that. Now, there are a number of different Baptist denominations in the United States today, and there's a lot of differences between them. It's hard to say what Baptists believe because there's so many different Baptists who believe different things. But in general, one of the things that unites Baptists from their name is they baptize people only after people make a decision to become a follower of Jesus. Another thing is that Baptists don't like a government-run church. Baptist churches do not recognize authority above the local church level. Baptist churches are governed solely at the local church level. And Baptist churches traditionally have more simple services without a bunch of ritual that exists between the other denominations. And Baptist churches own their own church. It was surprising to me. Well, it was surprising to me back when the Presbyterians, when people started getting upset at Presbyterian churches, how many Presbyterians didn't know that their local church didn't own their church. And throughout this Methodist disaffiliation process, it was surprising to me how many Methodists did not realize that they did not own their church. But Baptists do. Now, there are very liberal Baptist denominations. There are very conservative Baptist denominations. The Baptists came out of Calvinism. John Smith was a Calvinist. And Baptists were Calvinists up to about the turn of the 20th century, and the influence of Calvinism began to wane, and Baptists rejected the old Calvinist idea that God chose who would be saved, and then they said instead that God wants everyone to be saved, and it's up to individual choice. Now, the change in Baptist around the turn of the 20th century from saying that God chooses who's going to be saved and God, you choose if you're saved or not, brings up another man, a man named John Wesley. Now, John Wesley lived in the 1700s. He was the son of a priest in the Church of England, and he himself became a priest in the Church of England. And when he was in his mid-30s, he had what he described as a religious conversion, and he became dissatisfied with the Church of England. He felt that its officials and its priests were corrupt. People paid it no attention, and it was a dying church. And so Wesley began preaching. He said people are dying in their sins because they're not receiving the message of the gospel. And so he believed that he needed to go out and preach the gospel to people, and that's what he started doing. Not in churches, but outside the church. He just went to different places preaching the gospel. And Wesley rejected Calvinism. He believed God wants all people to be saved. And so Wesley believed that God works in everybody wanting you to become a Christian. But he believed it is up to you whether you do or not. And he believed that God's Spirit works within a person through hearing preaching. That it is during preaching when you will be led to become a Christian and accept Jesus. And so Wesley's preaching was designed to persuade people to make the choice to become a Christian. Now, if you go back to the Baptist churches, you realize that after the turn of the 20th century, when Baptist churches started changing and being non-Calvinist, that's what they started doing. So, really, when you think about it, Baptists rejected Calvin and accepted Wesley. And that's what happened around the turn of the century. But before that, Wesley himself, his preaching was characterized as dramatic, fiery, and it played on emotion. It was said that people got so worked up during his sermons that they passed out. And some people even had seizures during his sermon. And it was during such an emotional state like that, Wesley believed that people were more amenable to following Jesus. The preacher should create this emotional stir in people so they'll become a Christian. And this went along with other things he believed. He believed that worship should be spirit-filled, experienced. And he wanted people to clap their hands, jump and shout and carry on like that. That was a sign that God's Spirit was working in you. Wesley thought you should experience your faith through that. And Wesley said that after you become a Christian, if you try hard enough, you reach the point where you no longer sin. You no longer commit voluntary sins. You might occasionally make a minor slip up, but it wouldn't be on purpose. And you would not commit major sins anymore. Now, God's Spirit will work in you and help you achieve that, but you had to cultivate it. You had to work toward it. That's what's called holiness. And that's where the holiness denominations that we see, like Pentecostal Holiness Church, the Church of the Nazarene is Holiness Church. It's a denomination that's holiness. And that's an idea from Wesley where if you try hard enough, you can achieve holiness in life where you no longer sin. Now, Wesley's ideas came to this country and they spread like wildfire. Their preaching was usually outside, open air, revivals. They attracted a lot of people. From John Wesley, we get a variety of different denominations. Pentecostalism comes from Wesley. Pentecostalism is a form of Christianity that says that you experience gifts of the Spirit, like the power to heal, the power to prophesy, the power to speak in tongues. We already talked about the holiness denominations. That comes from John Wesley. And of course, the best known are the Methodist churches. The Methodist churches, of course, come from John Wesley. And why they have the word Methodist is that John Wesley had a method for living the Christian life. He had 3 hours every morning for prayer and Bible reading. And then for the rest of the day, he prayed every hour on the hour. And John Wesley kept a journal for every, and in that journal, every hour, he graded himself on a scale of 1 to 9 on how good a Christian he had been during the past hour. And if he didn't get a good score between 10 and 11, then between 11 and 12, he tried to do better. And so he developed this method for living the Christian life, and that's where the word Methodist comes from. Now, John Wesley himself never actually broke away from the Church of England. His preaching was emotional and fiery and done outdoors, but he saw value in the ritual and the hierarchy of the Church of England. Now, in the United States, of course, these groups did break off from the Church of England and formed their own denominations. But one of the things that you'll notice, the Methodist Church then actually came out of the Episcopal Church. And if you ever go to a Methodist church, one thing you'll notice that the Methodist Church, in some of them at least, tend to be a little more formal than like a Baptist church does. So that's the Baptist and Methodist. They both came out of Calvinism. The Baptists came out of Calvinism itself, and the Methodists came out of a reaction against Calvinism. But you may have noticed that there's a lot of issues around these things. I don't know if you've ever been to these different churches or not. If you go to a Methodist church, it has a completely different feel than a Baptist church, depending on which one you go to. And the same thing is true of all these different denominations. They have a little different feel to them. But there's actually a lot that they have in common. And there's one big issue that all of these share, whether they're Calvinists, Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, Holiness, Pentecostals, Lutherans, Presbyterians, or whatever, that at least officially, in their official doctrine, they see sin as the problem. And these denominations that we talked about today, the Baptists and the Methodists, were formed around the question of whose sins get forgiven. Now, the Calvinists were going around saying, well, the people that sins get forgiven are the people that God chooses to forgive the sin. And then John Wesley comes up and he says, no, the people whose sins get forgiven are the people who choose to turn to Jesus. You see, so the key there was whose sins get forgiven. The Catholics say the sins get forgiven of the people that come to the church and ask forgiveness. Okay, the major issue then between all this was whose sins get forgiven. And we see three different answers for that. If you look at the Baptists, they said initially that God decides. The Methodists say, no, you decide. Then the Baptists went over and took over the Methodist idea, and they say, yeah, we agree with you, you decide. And then the Catholic Church says, we decide. So it goes from God decides, you decide, or we, the church hierarchy, decide. So that's the dividing line between these denominations. They came out of the 1500s and 1600s. And most of the denominations that we see in the United States today came out of either the Baptist, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, or the Lutheran. But what about today? The question of whose sins get forgiven is not really on many people's mind today. It was 400 or 500 years ago, but that question doesn't line up with what people are concerned about today. You know, people today are concerned about issues like, we all know what they're concerned about today. So anyway, Presbyterians, though, have moved on from John Calvin. Baptists have moved on from John Calvin. Methodists have moved on from John Wesley. Methodists have moved on from anybody. Baptists have moved on from anybody. And these denominations today don't really stand for anything. They mainly reflect the personal preferences of the people who happen to be in control of them at the moment. If you want to know what Presbyterians believe, it might change next week. If you want to know what Baptists believe, that might change next week. Just who's in control is what we believe. Or what's out in society is what we believe. There's one thing you can say about the major denominations in the United States: there has never been a societal trend that they have not jumped on the bandwagon and supported. And we see that today. The point being, the denominations as we know them are dying in the United States. And the reason they are dying is because they stand for nothing. And the reason they stand for nothing is because they came into being at a time when one certain question was on people's mind. And that's when they came into being. Today that question is no longer on people's mind. There is other questions on people's minds, and the denominations have nothing to make themselves specific and peculiar about anymore, and so they just become a general whitewashing thing with whatever you want to do. The moral of the story is this: Christianity is not tied up with any denomination. It's not tied up with any kind of ritualistic thinking. It's not tied up with anything like that. Christianity is about one thing, and that is Jesus Christ. It is not the official property of any certain denomination. It is the official property of everybody. And I hope we'll keep that in mind as denominations come and go, and all these news stories hit the news, that we'll just think, okay, they don't have a monopoly on the Christian faith. They think they do, and a lot of them do, believe me, but they do not.